The Daleks were originally created by comedy writer Terry Nation, who created the Daleks during the inception of Doctor Who, being introduced in its second ever serial, and they very much made Doctor Who a success, and made it what it is today, triggering the famous Dalek mania of the 1960s. And they were based on Terry Nation's experience in World War II, and on the ideology of the Nazi threat. The Daleks have continued to have a major part to play in Doctor Who, and as such, there have been a lot of Dalek stories. This is why, with the recent airing of the most recent Dalek story, Revolution of the Daleks, I've decided to rank all of the Dalek stories from worst to best. I would like to first clarify that this is all subjective and very much my own personal opinion. I will only be including TV appearances, so no Big Finish or other expanded Doctor Who media. I'll also be excluding cameo appearances from the likes of the Space Museum and Twice Upon a Time, so the Daleks will have to have played an active role in the story to be included on this list. And I won't be including Mission to the Unknown, as I don't think it's fair to judge a single 25-minute episode against all the other, considerably longer stories. And I won't be including Army of Ghosts and Doomsday, just because I don't think the Daleks have central focus, as it's a Daleks versus Cybermen story, and unlike a lot of stories of the Master, it isn't a recognisable trend or ongoing theme. The way the story is structured makes it difficult to categorise it as a Dalek story for me. This is part 1 of 2 videos where in this part I'll be ranking places 24 to 13. So let's begin. Having watched through everything, this had to be at the very bottom. In all the other stories, I could find at least some redeemable qualities. But in this story, I found very little redeemable qualities. The story starts with the Doctor, Amy and Rory being kidnapped and taken to the Parliament of the Daleks, which makes no sense as the Daleks are fascists, designed to reflect Nazi Germany. And they're kidnapped by humans enhanced by Dalek technology, who feel very silly and don't have the threat the story wants them to. The idea of an asylum of insane Daleks is an interesting idea, but why the Daleks would lock them up rather than just destroy them, I have no idea. It would make more sense if they were prisoners of another enemy. The Daleks in this story, besides a small scene with Rory when they are trying to say exterminate, hold no threat or tension or any scares. The Doctor, Amy and Rory just happily stroll through the asylum with no conflict. You never get the sinister scares that there could be Daleks lurking in every corner, waiting to exterminate you, or understand why these Daleks are more insane and dangerous than any of the others. We have the introduction of Oswin in this story, who would later evolve into Clara, who is very much a genius. But in this story, she's nothing but grating and irritating. She is overly cocky, confident, arrogant, smug, and overtly and annoyingly flirtatious. And there is no kind of emotional struggle or vulnerability to empathise and relate to her. She is simply a combination of the most generic Steve Moffat traits for a female character, with no depth, and as such, you never relate to her or care about her death and sacrifice. We also have the most annoying and unnecessary subplot in all of Doctor Who, which is Amy and Rory's divorce. Now this could have worked as an arc over the series if we had seen their marriage struggle, especially if they had acknowledged the loss of Melody Pond. But it's just there to insert unnecessary conflict, and it's resolved off screen. The two are very mean-spirited towards one another, so you don't root for them, and Amy's decision of giving Rory up is framed like she was in the right, even though it makes no sense, because if she couldn't have kids, there are other options with them as a couple, but the story doesn't even acknowledge the flawed decision-making of Amy as a character. Amy and Rory are my favourite companions since the show's return in 2005, but this is a key low point for them as characters. But the reason this story is at the very bottom is the decision to wipe the Daleks of any memory of the Doctor. It's an incredibly dumb idea because the Doctor's relationship with the Daleks, and that evolving relationship and conflict, is part of what makes them so captivating as villains. So robbing the show of almost 50 years of development at that point is a very dumb idea. Luckily, Stephen Moffat recognised the mistake almost immediately and rectified it. But it's a dumb idea regardless, and makes the history between the characters feel rather pointless. Terry Nation's final script for Doctor Who is easily his worst, but I have a feeling it was made worse by the tampering of Douglas Adams, whose comedy in the right story can work great, but here it just completely diminishes the Daleks as a threat. But before I discuss the Daleks, I have to remark on the complete missed opportunity to have a post-regeneration story for Romana. We have a new generation of a companion, and we spend no time getting to know Lalla Ward's interpretation of the character. The return of Davros was always going to unfortunately diminish his death in Genesis of the Daleks, but David Goodison unfortunately failed to impress as the character, as the script doesn't do him any favours. He's forced to wear Michael Wish's mask, and it looks embarrassing, and he comes across just as a raving lunatic rather than the layered character we got in Genesis of the Daleks, who was cunning, with a dangerous mentality, and harmful viewpoints. I have to question why Davros is so trusting of the Daleks after they exterminated him at the end of Genesis of the Daleks. In this story, he is given rather generic dialogue, and the Doctor never really seems to take Davros seriously. The Daleks come across in a similar way. They are incredibly unthreatening in the way they rant and shout instructions like "do not move," which causes them to come across as an embarrassment. The Doctor also constantly makes fun of the Daleks and the fact that they can't come after him, and his wheeling of Davros around is also embarrassing, and it means you can't take either of them seriously as a threat. They certainly never come across as the most dangerous force in the universe like they're meant to. Terry Nation, the man who created the Daleks, also seems to have forgotten what made the Daleks so scary in the first place. It's remarked upon that they were once organic, but now have become robots. And the script seems to have forgotten that there is a Dalek mutant in each and every one of those tanks. They are dangerous for their Nazi parallels and their hatred of all other life forms, whereas Destiny of the Daleks makes them into dull and useless robots at war with the Movellans, another robot life form, who have been stuck at an impasse for centuries because of their reliance upon logic, which underestimates the clever and cunning nature of the Daleks in the early 60s stories like in Power of the Daleks. The Movellans are also so obviously robots, but the script treats it like this big revelation, and they are never very interesting as a race in their history of the Daleks, and their motivations are very underdeveloped. We also have an incredible missed opportunity with the character of Tyson, who is an escaped prisoner of the Daleks who manages to rally all of the escaped workers together at the end of the story. We could have seen a character arc of him struggling under fear and paranoia at the beginning of the story, only for him to find the courage to rally the prisoners together and oppose the Daleks at the end. It feels like such an obvious arc that they've forgotten to include. Overall, it's a story that's forgotten what makes the Daleks so threatening and interesting. This is a story that unfortunately has some of the strongest ideas from any story on this list, and probably some of the best moments, but it's full of not just clunky storytelling, but with story elements that diminish and devalue the Daleks as a threat. The idea is great of taking the idea from Genesis the Daleks and expanding upon it with the Doctor contemplating on the moral decision whether it is right to kill Davros as a child to destroy the Daleks, whether by leaving him he created the Davros of the future, if by helping him he could have stopped the Daleks from ever existing. It's a great idea, but it deserved a whole story dedicated to it, rather than being alluded to. And it also does not fit with the whole storyline of Davros growing old as he's dying and wanting to settle an argument with the Doctor and prove himself right. We have some solid emotional scenes with Davros opening up to the Doctor, only to deceive and manipulate him. But it's bogged down by the hybrid storyline, and we have a concept which devalues the very concept of the Daleks. It's revealed that the Dalek casing and machinery blocks out human emotions, basically making the Dalek creature useless and reliant on their casing, and not very evil. It could easily be anyone inside the casing and be just as dangerous. The Nazi mentality and dangerous hatred is disposed of, only to make it a piece of machinery and nothing else, which makes the Daleks far less interesting. We also have silly things like the Daleks having compassion for Davros as their father built into their DNA, despite generations of betraying him numerous times. And there's the whole concept that the Doctor taught Davros mercy as a child, who planted it in the Daleks, demonstrating the value of mercy. Which it suggests the Daleks have some level of good in them as creatures, which devalues and diminishes their impact as the most evil race in the universe. I know in recent years I've seen this story get a lot more love and appreciation. I also want you to know that on this rewatch, I went into each and every story with an open mind. Stories maybe which I disliked initially, I went in wanting to give them a second chance. But I still really don't like this story, and for me it is one of the very worst of the 10th Doctor era. I do like the initial and basic idea, similar to either of the Daleks, showing a cunning side to the Daleks, seeing them trying to survive and trying to find new ways to evolve and reinvent themselves on the edge of extinction. But it's the direction they take them I have a huge problem with. I know this story is meant to be demonstrating a clear point in the Daleks having the chance to evolve and be better, but their efforts to remain pure are restricting them. But the behaviour and beliefs of Dalek Sec is hugely out of character for a Dalek, which I know is intentional, but I just find it unbelievable that any Dalek under the Emperor and created under Davros' genetic programming would come to the conclusions Dalek Sec does, with his values very much going against all the values of what makes the Daleks who they are. It feels unbelievable to me that Dalek Sec would reach this conclusion without some serious illness, genetic tampering, or traumatizing experience that would affect their outlook. But the Dalek Sec we saw in Doomsday still very much believe very clearly in the Daleks as the supreme race. I just feel we haven't seen enough of their growth needed to make this changed mentality believable or to justify it. There is very little to define Dalek Sec as a Dalek beyond its appearance and their inability to evolve in this case, which makes them weaker rather than more dangerous. I honestly find the whole idea of a human-Dalek hybrid very bad, and the design of the human Dalek is very ill-advised, and with a very stunted and clunky performance. The idea of the Daleks recognising admirable traits in humanity has potential, but hybrid is very silly and disregards the genetic purity of the Daleks, portrays in a way that isn't believable and doesn't make sense. I think the idea of the Daleks trying to find a way to live out of the shell again would have been a much better idea. This was a story I'd always remembered as not being great. If anything, there's nothing beyond fairly mediocre. But watching it again, I think it's a little beyond that, because I just found it incredibly weak and poor. Before rewatching this story, there are certain stories above it I would have initially put below it, but at least those stories were original, where this story fails to be. If you explain the concept of the Daleks trying to reawaken a frozen army, using the Spiridons as slaves, using a plague to destroy all life on the planet, and then use their army to conquer and invade, I think the concept has a lot of threat, but it's never portrayed in a way that has a lot of threat. It's a big disappointment leading on from Frontier in Space, which proved to be a very exciting political thriller, with scale with the Mast and the Daleks trying to invoke a war between the humans and Draconians. But this story just fails to live up to that with the Daleks' quest. The Daleks start out as ruthless, destroying the foul spaceship, whilst believing Joe's on board. But after that, they just kind of become useless. The Daleks are commanding, but do little to show their threat. The Dalek Supreme has a very striking design, and proves to be ruthless with the way he disposes of a Dalek who fails him, but he really should have had a bigger role in the story. We have the idea of the Daleks using the Spyrodons for the power of invisibility, but we never really get to see the Daleks utilise this power, which is a shame, because the Daleks with the power of invisibility could be very sinister. What makes this story really disappointing though, is not only how it feels like it's recycling all the ideas from previous Dalek stories, but with less than half of the energy of all those stories. It feels like a repeat of the first Dalek story with the Doctor and the Thals going up against the Daleks, a daring escape plan from the Daleks, and the concept of hiding yourself within a Dalek casing, as well as the Daleks trying to destroy all life on the planet, incredibly similar to the plot and the plan in the Daleks. The plot and story structure is exactly the same to the point where it kind of feels like a rip-off of the original Dalek story. It also manages to take the idea of a plague, which had already been a big part of the Dalek invasion of Earth. The only Dalek story of the 1960s I don't think is particularly strong, and is rather a bad story. The idea for the story is a logical place to take the Daleks, with the Daleks becoming tired of the Doctor's meddling in their affairs, as they chase the Doctor across multiple planets and across history. But in order for this to work, I think it needs to either play as part of a story arc across the season, or expand the story and spend much more time in each individual location, which is where the Daleks' master plan succeeded later, where this story failed. The chase just doesn't take itself very seriously and feels overly silly and gimmicky, shoehorning the Daleks in with other random elements, but not in a way that feels authentic, creepy, threatening, or makes sense. One of the main problems is that there is a rather thin plot. We have the Daleks chasing the Doctor and his companions across the universe, but they are just running from place to place and from obstacle to obstacle, with no primary motivation for the characters, and a large amount of the story feels incredibly disposable. I think the final episode actually does show a lot of potential, and if they had based the whole story around this concept, I think it might have been very enjoyable, as I like the idea of the mechanoids as robots developed by humanity to help colonise Mechanus, and they've built society but the planet has been abandoned. I enjoy their design and their conflict, and their final battle with the Daleks is great. I just wish it had been further developed. I also enjoy the way they introduce Stephen as a character who's very likeable, and I think that's very well done and implemented. And I think Ian and Barbara's departure as they go back home is very emotional for the Doctor, with some solid character drama, as the Doctor is forced to let them go even if he doesn't want to. But also very uplifting and happy as they are finally returned to their correct time and place. This is a story I've always been confused by because so many fans seem to really like it, and it's a story I've never liked or enjoyed. But on this recent rewatch, I did gain some more appreciation of the story. It's still a story I don't think is very good, but I do think has a lot of merit. I like the idea of a facility where the upper class can cryogenically freeze their bodies until there is a cure for whatever illness they are currently dying from. I also like the idea of Davros taking this facility over to use human bodies to create Dalek embryos and rebuild the Dalek race as he sees fit, and there is some fittingly dark imagery. I also think for a story that doesn't feature the Doctor very much, it doesn't manage to keep you engaged with some rather strong performances. But I have a problem with the inherent lack of focus, meaning not any of the characters or villains really get developed or fleshed out because the story is too thinly spread over too many storylines to dedicate good time towards. The Jobal storyline could have worked to show Davros' willingness to manipulate others and also get rid of anyone trying to oppose him, but it's poorly executed. I think there is a fundamental element in this story which stops me being able to invest in it, and it's the world building and lack of context. I would like to know what kind of place this was before Davros took it over, and how everyone working there feels about Davros. This could have been a great story about Davros tricking and manipulating a place trying to do good, which at times feels like the intention, but it's undermined by Jobal as a rather corrupt and slimy character. It could have been a great story about an already corrupt environment which Davros takes advantage of, as Davros and the facility are both manipulating each other. But if that was ever going to work, you need to develop one single villain as an obstacle for Davros. The Kazan Jazani has a whole world of corruption, but it's focused in the conflict between Sharazjek and Morgus. We also have the Daleks, rather underused, acting as hench figures disappointingly, and the Doctor's lack of presence in the plot is portrayed in a way where you really feel his lack of impact, and he isn't taken out of the story enough for it to feel like a Doctor-like adventure. But the whole story is just poorly structured that feels underwhelming. The building of events across the story comes to very little in its climax, and it's a real shame this is Colin Baker's only on-screen adventure with the Daleks. I'm glad you got stories like Jubilee on audio later on. I'm not sure this story should really be this high, as it's quite weak and not very good, but although the plot is incredibly unoriginal and has some major elements which diminishes the impact of the Daleks, I think it is fairly well structured and easy to watch, and for that reason I would much rather watch it than the likes of Revelation of the Daleks and The Chase, which due to the bad structure means they are more tiresome to sit through and watch. This does have some positives. It's Peter Capaldi's second story, and he's fantastic, showing himself as single-minded and logical, sacrificing lives for the greater good, and it works well in the arc of questioning himself as a good man. I think unfortunately Clara is rather underused in this story as well, which is unfortunate as Series 8 very much improves upon her character from Series 7. The main problem with this story is the repetitive storyline, and how it feels like it directly mimics the same story from Dalek, with the Doctor having a single-minded hatred against the Daleks, having a Dalek locked up, and the companion putting the Doctor in check, allowing him to have a moment of self-realisation and re-examine himself, and the Dalek telling the Doctor he is a good Dalek. It repeats the same storyline and the exact same structure, and the themes are very similar, examining the good within a Dalek and whether a Dalek is capable of good, which I'm not saying doesn't have potential, but the story doesn't justify revisiting that idea. Given this is the most recent Dalek story, there is more of a chance this may move above or below this point, but right now, this is where I'm putting Revolution of the Daleks. I think this is a very frustrating story because there's a lot of great things in it, but it's bogged down by being overstuffed by too many ideas. It definitely has its highlights. It's great to see Captain Jack back. Also, although I've not been a fan of Graham and Ryan as characters, and Tosin Cole unfortunately still suffers from wooden execution of dialogue, and Graham is definitely underused, I think their exit is handled brilliantly, and is very emotionally impactful, and Ryan's exit feels earned. The downfall of this story is the missed opportunities, or its failure to build upon and expand upon its themes and ideas. Jodie Whittaker is strong in her role, and is very underutilised, with the prison storyline being shoehorned into the front half of the episode, and disposed of quickly, when it deserved a story of its own, and a misjudged, clunky character arc for her Doctor. We also have great themes of security at the expense of freedom and privatisation, but it's badly developed and never takes a stance or makes a specific point. They fail to explore the major themes, and this goes for the Daleks as well. I like how it acts as a sequel to Resolution, but the idea of a Dalek Civil War is a great way of exploring the Daleks' obsession with purity and their Nazi mentality, especially with these mutated Daleks. But there is so much focus on the build-up that the execution is rather lacking and underdeveloped, and the story barely scratches the surface of the idea. If you look at the big finish story, Blood of the Daleks, you'll get an idea of the potential of this idea and the concept that is unfortunately underdeveloped. It's certainly a lot better and more enjoyable than the stories below it, but it's the Dalek story with some of the biggest missed opportunities. Resurrection of the Daleks is a story a lot of fans seem to really enjoy, but I just can't connect with. It's a story that almost works, but it gets a number of fundamental elements wrong, which holds it back. I think Davros is utilised a lot better here than he was in Destiny of the Daleks. He has the cunning intelligence back, as the story utilises him as a scientist, and he is aware the Daleks are going to betray him, and he is sneakily plotting a way to build his own race of Daleks in order to conquer them. They are both cunningly trying to destroy one another, and his motives are simply in trying to perfect the Daleks to create the dominant creature, which he feels he has failed at. I also think the scene of the Doctor attempting to execute Davros is a great scene of compelling drama between two scientists. The Doctor doesn't want to kill him, but knows the cost of letting him live. I also think the final scene of Tegan's departure is the most realistic ending for any companion. The Fifth Doctor's life was surrounded by death and destruction, and he was almost brought down because of it by the end of his run. And the death of Adric clearly had a lot of impact, and therefore seeing his primary companion leave because of the impact of the death, as it becomes too much to bear, makes a lot of sense. But although Davros works very well within the story, like most of the stories after Genesis of the Daleks, he very much holds back the Daleks. The Daleks work well, but they could have been much better. I love how the story shows the threat of the Daleks, not just as war machines, but the threat of the Dalek mutant and creature, as it attacks one of the soldiers. And they are very clever and cunning as a presence, but in battle, unfortunately they fail to impress, retreating immediately as they are introduced, and not having much of an active role to play in the rest of the story in terms of threat. But the main problem is that the plot is too convoluted and too complicated, with way too many layers and subplots. There is no focus on what the story is about, and what story Eric Saward is trying to tell. We have Davros trying to find a way to cure the Mavellan virus, whilst also building his own race of Daleks, and then we have the Daleks duplicating the Doctor in an attempt to assassinate the High Council of the Time Lords. Both great ideas, but because both stories are being told at the same time, neither get the chance or opportunity for development. We also get the problem in that the Dalek duplicate's purpose is not conveyed to the audience, and we never really get a chance to get our head around the logistics and limitations of them. And Stein's revelation as a Dalek agent not only feels very jarring, but his conflict as he turns on the Daleks is very undeveloped because of the annoying amount of subplots, which really diminishes the story. Day of the Daleks is a decent Dalek story. It's a strong opener to season 9 with a good plot, but it hasn't left much lasting impact, and certainly does have a lot of flaws. It's a very Terminator-style plot, but way before the Terminator came out. A very timey-wimey plot. We have a plot where a character called Sir Reginald Styles is having a peace conference to prevent World War III, but some extremist fighters come from the 22nd century to prevent him from killing everyone in the peace conference and starting a chain of events which leads to the Daleks' oppression of Earth in the 22nd century. The Daleks rule over Earth with humanity being hopeless, with anybody who stands against them being aggressively tortured and oppressed. A world where the Doctor and Joe are told the people live in happiness, but innocent working people live in a world of cruelty to keep them in check, with no free will. The trouble is the oppression and unhappiness of the people is only told to the viewer via the controller. We never see the unhappiness and oppression in order to empathise with Earth's situation. I just wish it was further developed, because we never develop upon the harsh conditions and oppression of the people. It's a very undeveloped idea, and the Daleks lack an active role in the plot and the story, which makes it an unsatisfying story for them. But unlike a story like The Invasion, where Tobias Vaughan makes up for the inactive role of the Cybermen with a menacing presence as a villain, I think Aubrey Woods, as the controller, brings much of a theatre performance, lacking the serious conviction and the menace of a villain, but also lacks much empathy or regret to allow us to sympathise with him, which is why he never really works. I think what really does work, though, is the Ogrons, as they make for really fun henchmen as enforcers and mercenaries, but the main plot is really great as well. The timey-wimey plot in how the fighters travel back in time to stop the events to come, only to come to realise their actions is what causes them, is a really clever closed-loop plotline, which utilises the timey-wimey time travel nature of the Doctor's life, and cleverly uses time travel as a central mechanism of Doctor Who in an exciting and satisfying way, and it's what makes this story such fun. As a Dalek story, it's very underwhelming. As a dystopian future story about oppression, it's underwhelming, but as a fun time travel story, it's a lot of fun. I think this is the best Dalek story of the Third Doctor era, but it still isn't brilliant. It's an enjoyable, fun, action-adventure story that does something new with the Daleks, but it does have considerable flaws, and I don't think it presents the Daleks at their best. It's the mostly strong serial that has a couple of flaws, but the few flaws it does have are unfortunately quite prominent ones that does drag the quality of the story down somewhat. I think the Daleks prove to be a sufficient threat as they maintain control over humanity and the Exelons. I love seeing the Daleks vulnerable, forced to work with humanity, and without power, being forced to use bullets rather than the standard Dalek weaponry. But there are a few moments that show them as rather useless, and diminish their threat and prevent them from rising above that. They are rather easily defeated by the Exelons, and when one of the Daleks fails to find Jill, it becomes paranoid with failure and shuts itself down, which is rather pathetic, coming from Doctor Who's primary antagonist. We also have rather dull characters with a lack of character progression from all of them, meaning the story comes to a very satisfying conclusion, but lacks the emotional impact the story intends it to have. We also have some underwhelming cliffhangers, and the route is rather a disappointing and silly obstacle and threat for the Doctor at the end of episode 2. But I really like the Exelons. I really love their design and concepts as species. They're once intelligent species with their influence across the universe, even leaving their mark on Earth. I think the main reason why this story is so enjoyable is because of the stakes. There is a plague spread across several planets that the Daleks intend to use it as a source of bargaining for their own superiority. Plague has played a part in Dalek stories before, but in this story, it feels like our stakes and threat. Hardly original, but it is well executed. It is a very real threat in the future of humanity, where the survival of humanity depends on the mission. Maybe it's because at the moment COVID is a very real threat, but you do really root for the characters and their success. I think it's why, although it's a flawed story, I am willing to overlook some elements because it has a lot of things to enjoy. So that concludes part 1 of my Dalek stories ranking, where you can see a transition from the very worst of the Daleks to some of the stronger Dalek stories. You can return tomorrow, where I'll be getting down to my favourite Dalek stories, and ranking places 12 to 1. The stories that have represented the Daleks at their best, and shown the truly evil threat they still represent.